I don't believe men were created to be pawns in someone else's game. I believe we were created to be steward kings. Men under authority, yes, but entrusted with real responsibility. Not perfect men, but disciplined ones. Men who rule themselves, serve God directly, and refuse to live in fear. King, not pawn. There's a phrase in scripture that confuses a lot of men, honestly. It's David is described as a man after God's own heart. And if you know David's story, that doesn't really make immediate sense because, David himself wasn't exactly flawless. He wasn't clean in the way that people expect. He failed publicly. He sinned on a very serious level and he made decisions that had real consequences. And yet, that's the man that God points to in almost all of Scripture, not as an exception, but as the standard. You know, there's this question that most men don't really ask. They'll read David's story and they'll ask the wrong question. The question that most guys ask is, how could God still choose him? When instead, the real question we should be asking is, what made David different? Because it sure as heck wasn't perfection, okay? What it was posture. So let's go ahead and talk about the man who's seen early, okay? Before David was king, he was invisible. He was the youngest son. He was often overlooked. He was just out in the field tending to sheep. When Samuel comes to anoint the next king, David isn't even brought into the room. His own family didn't even consider him fit, right? And that's where it begins because God says something critical. Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. And that's what the difference is. Because David's strength, it was internal first. Before David even had a crown, he had alignment. Before he had any kind of influence whatsoever, he had self-discipline. Before he was recognized in any capacity in front of people, he had a personal relationship with God. And that's why when no one was watching, he was still developing. He was still training. He was still trusting. He was building something internal. So let's talk about that Goliath moment, okay? And what it actually shows. Because everyone always talks about David and Goliath, but most people miss what's really happening here, okay? Because this wasn't just bravery. This is what alignment looks like under pressure. You have an entire army standing still. You have experienced men, trained soldiers, and one young man decides to step forward, not because he's reckless in any capacity, but because he sees clearly. And this is a moment you guys will notice as men, is where others stay silent. So David, he hears Goliath mock God, and he doesn't process it the way that everybody else does. Everyone else sees this giant. David sees misalignment. That's what the difference is. Because when a man is aligned with God, he doesn't evaluate situations the same way. He doesn't ask, what's safe. He asks, what's right? So David, he was bold, but he wasn't independent. And here's something important, okay? Because while David was bold, he wasn't self-reliant. He didn't just walk up to Goliath and say, I've got this. In fact, what he actually said was, the Lord who delivered me before will deliver me again. See, that's the pattern. Confidence rooted in God, not in ego. But, as we know, David still fell. And here's where most men struggle, because David's story, it didn't stay clean. Okay, there was the moment where he drifted. He becomes passive. He stays behind when he should be out leading in front of battle. And that's when it happens. Okay, so let's talk about this quiet drift for a moment, because it doesn't really start with some massive failure. It starts small. It's a shift in posture, less vigilance, less discipline, less alignment, and then, finally, a decision. And that decision then leads to another one. And before long, David's completely off. You know, let's talk about it. The failure that kind of exposed everything for him. David commits adultery. Then he tries to cover it up. Then he orchestrates the death of Uriah, right? See, this isn't minor. This is a serious failure. And this is where most men, they expect the story to end. So now we have to talk about why it didn't end and why we still have this story to this day, because it's because of what happens next. Nathan, the prophet, he goes ahead and he confronts David directly. There's no soft language. There's no easing into it. He just goes at him, just truth. And David responds immediately. Here's where the difference is, okay? Because David, he didn't defend himself. This is what that defining moment was. David doesn't argue. He doesn't attempt to justify. He doesn't try to shift the blame onto anybody else. He says, I have sinned against the Lord. And that right there is it. Okay, there was no performance. There was no delay. Just fully, complete acceptance and ownership. And that's where most men fall. Because most men, they don't break like that. It's not in failure where they break. It's in their response to it. Men will clear as day fail something, and yet they will defend it. They will try to minimize it. They blame circumstances, all to try and protect their image, because protecting their reputation feels way safer than confronting the reality, right? And this is why it's important. David, he chose alignment with God over his own personal image. He didn't protect his image the way that our culture would kind of expect one to do today. He exposed himself before God. He repented fully, not just halfway, not just conditionally, okay, but completely. And it's that action right there is what restored him. So what is this real meaning of after God's heart? Okay, this is something that a lot of men still miss. Because being after God's heart doesn't mean you never fall. It just means that when you do, you return quickly, fully, without resistance. There's, as I've kind of been walking around and just observing things, right? I've noticed that there's two different types of men. There's men who fall and they harden their hearts and they really just drift. And then there's men who fall and they return. David, he was the second one. That's why he was trusted. So when it comes to us as guys, there's a moment that we all have, where we know that we're off. We're not guessing, we're not wondering. We just know. And it's in that moment that we either turn back to God or we try and justify staying where we're at. That decision right there, that's everything. So why is it that David's the standard? Well, David, he wasn't chosen because he never sinned. Okay, we've definitely gone through that one. He was chosen because he never stayed misaligned. He corrected himself quickly. He humbled himself. He stayed teachable. He stayed coachable. And that's what made him dangerous in the best way possible. So let's go ahead and contrast that with modern man. Because today, most men, they care more about appearance than alignment. I think we're even starting to see this in slang words like, I think they call it looks maxing or something like that. They want to look right, sound right, be perceived as strong. You see some of these young kids out there filling their bodies up with all sorts of I don't know what, fillers and things like that when they can't even bench 135 pounds, but they want to be perceived as strong. Internally, I do kind of pity them because those individuals are off, and I hope that eventually they return. because right now they're so focused on protecting their own image that they can't actually correct themselves. And you cannot grow without correction. And that's the part that's tough, because if you cannot admit when you're wrong, you're just going to stay exactly where you are. David grew because he stayed open, even when it hurt. Okay? So ultimately, guys, if you haven't remembered anything I've said in the video thus far, please remember this. Okay? God's not looking for the perfect man. Okay? He's looking for the man who will return to him quickly, fully, and without resistance. Okay? So don't protect your image at the cost of your alignment. Don't justify what you know to be off, because the man who corrects quickly becomes a man that God can trust. Okay? You will fall. That's not the question here. The question is, when you do, will you return?